evening to everybody in Moscow. Good afternoon to me, myself, in Brussels, and good morning to Tom Graham in Washington. My name is Giles Merritt. I'll be moderating today's session. I'm a former Financial Times journalist and the founder of one of the larger Brussels think tanks called Friends of Europe. This is, I think, the fourth or the fifth EU-Russia session in the Gaidar Forum. It's certainly the third I've attended and the second that I've moderated. The first time in virtual form. First of all, before we get started, I want to pay tribute to the man who's organized all this, Paul Revet, who was a long-time European director of the Trilateral Commission, and he's been the driving force behind putting together these sessions and in previous years. Now, we're going to talk about Greater Europe. Is it still on the horizon? Well, the reality, I think we all know, is that relations are worryingly worsening. And I just looked at a few pointers to get us started with. Yesterday, Carnegie Moscow came out with a very interesting report on some focus groups. And the two things I picked out of that was that opinion in Russia was broadly concerned with domestic affairs, didn't much like President Putin's idea of staying on till 2036. But where they were very clear was they thought Russia should be tougher with the West, and they welcomed Russia's return as a great power. And I have to say, then I looked at something that the Valdai Club had done last September, which was worrying, I thought. The Valdai members said, we must expect more mutual alienation with Europe, permanent military tension. And reportedly, President Putin told that meeting in September, Europe is no longer an independent, reliable partner in international affairs. On the Western side, things are no better. In the US, there are now a slew of calls to the Biden administration when it takes over to keep up the pressures on Russia, sanctions, and so on. And there's also a lot of NATO saber rattling. And last autumn we saw what I thought was an unnecessarily large military exercise up in Finland. So my own view is that we're going into an era of growing global problems. And yet the intra-European frictions are growing, even though they are sterile and irrelevant and of no benefit to either side. So with that very jolly introduction, let me just lay out the rules. We've got 5 speakers, a mere 45 minutes of which I've taken up rather too much. I'm going to ask each of our speakers one question, and I'm giving them 5 minutes to answer it, and I'll start to get a bit restless if they go over the 5 minutes, and that will allow us, theoretically, enough time for an interesting debate from each other on what we've heard, what you've heard from one another. We're going to start, first of all, with Igor Yurgens, a good friend, chairman of the Institute for Contemporary Development in Moscow, and I think a noted modernizer in Russian affairs, as well as a former economic advisor to Dmitri Medvedev when he was president. So, Igor, over to you, 5 minutes, and the question which you've already had notice of, what is Russia's approach likely to be to multilateral and even global questions like climate change, COVID, and the idea that's been floating around of a P5 Security Council summit, permanent members on security issues. Igor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everybody. Hello, wherever you are. And let me start with the idea which was circulated last night in Gaidar's forum at the previous discussion on Europe. People were saying that big Europe is now from Lisbon to Tallinn only. And I would argue that that's not true, because even at this very sad stage of events and relations between Russia and the European Union, a lot of people still consider big Europe to include big Eurasia, and we think that Europe is from Lisbon to Vladivostok. I'm partly in business world at the moment, and I can tell you that the pressure from both sides, European Union and Russian business, is to restore a lot of relations and contacts in spite of sanctions and all of that stuff. Doctrinal documents of Russian Federation, including the strategy of foreign policy, relies heavily on United Nations system and international law, the way Russian leadership understand that system. And from this point of view, when you say, Giles, that are we interested in, for example, COP21 as the Paris Charter on environment? Are we interested in togetherness in COVID fight? Are we interested in P5? Yes. The only problem is that the Russian leadership would like to be at the top table, and it is not at the moment. And it's being pushed out of the category of the top table. And it's being pushed into a little bit of unnatural alliance, unnatural marriage of convenience with China. And by definition, by virtue of the size of industry and the economy, as a younger partner, as a younger brother of big China. All of this, from my point of view, brings us to the idea that we will be in a period of difficult relations, but that doesn't mean that we cannot restore it in the foreseeable future. All of those three things which you mentioned will be supported by Russia with reserve. In any of those issues, Russian leadership will keep in mind the national interest of Russian Federation the way they see it. One of the examples will be, for example, if we talk about environment and if we talk about COP21 and green economy, the latest, which is considered by the Russian leadership and part of the business class as unfair competition, is this hydrogen economy and the convention on taxing the so-called carbon tax. The short-term loss, if this carbon tax is going to be implemented and enforced, is about $33 billion. And now the government and the groups of business are working on the ideas how to avoid all of that. On the other side, when you talk to the German business, which yesterday announced that it will carry on with the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, when we talk to them, they are talking about blue hydrogen, which will be pumped by this northern pipeline. It's futuristic at the moment, but nobody wants to cut the ties off. So from my point of view, from the doctrinal documents of Russian government, from the real and very tangible interest of Russian business, from the reciprocal interests of business circles, and I'm not even mentioning academia, cultural people, and many others, we're still very much bound to each other. Reliable or not reliable partners, European Union, that's political category. Sometimes those political categories can be changed overnight. It will not happen overnight in this particular case, but the foundation, both economic, Judeo-Christian culture of ours, our Europeanness, makes me believe that we will remain in big Europe, even if some clusters of our population and of our bureaucrats would consider themselves to be out of it. And I probably would stop at it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Igor. Thank you very much for that. And thanks for the timekeeping. And when we come back to a general discussion, maybe we could talk a bit about how Russia and Russian diplomacy could get those more positive messages over more effectively. And now let's turn to Markus Ederer, the EU ambassador to the Russian Federation, and I should say a noted EU troubleshooter who was previously the ambassador in Beijing. Markus, the question to you. As the EU has never defined a Russia policy, has that made its dealings with Moscow easier because more flexible, or harder because less clear-cut?
Thank you, Giles, and a very happy New Year to all of you and all listeners. Novem Godem. I will make 3 remarks. The first one is on the lead question of the panel on the future of Greater Europe and what COVID has done to that. First of all, we in the EU believe that Russia is part of Europe. I think that's a very important fact, geographically, economically, culturally, historically, and we will never close that door. We will never close that door. However, the concept of Greater Europe, as I would call it geopolitical concept, has lost much of its luster, and where we sit, we would say that it was Russia walking out of this concept and replacing it with the Greater Eurasian Partnership, conceptually, while defining Russia's relationship with the EU rather by distinction, different values, and increasingly by confrontation than cooperation. And the pandemic has deepened that alienation by what we have seen as wars of narratives, information, and politicized mask and vaccination diplomacy. Secondly, to your more specific question, I would suggest to all of you that the EU has more of a Russia policy than certainly the US had a discernible Russia policy over the last 4 years. And for that purpose, more of a policy than Russia has an identifiable EU policy. As you all know, and I will not go into details, it consists of the 5 guiding principles underlying the EU's relation with Russia, adopted by the Foreign Affairs Council in March 2016. And while I will spare you from enumeration, it ranges from the implementation of the Minsk agreements as a key condition for any substantial change in our relations with Russia to selective engagement in the EU's interest with Russia. And I believe it's a transparent and clear policy statement. In contrast to that, my question is, where do you find an equally transparent and clear policy statement on Russia's policy vis-a-vis the EU? What is Russia's policy vis-a-vis the EU? And for some time, and I even remember Alexander Grushko last year, who regrettably is not on the panel this year, told us that the policy was to go back to the status quo until 2014, basically to business as usual, which we thought was unrealistic, given the illegal annexation of Crimea and the rest. More recently, Foreign Minister Lavrov and others have called or have questioned the usefulness of any relations with Brussels, propagating himself no business as usual. So while I believe that breaking relations with the EU entirely is not only not a policy, but tactically and strategically flawed, given the geographical, historical, and cultural proximity that ties us together, as mentioned above, but also for the Russian dependency on EU investment, trade, and technology. Maybe no business as usual could be a starting point for a sober discussion on what we really and realistically want from each other. And my last point is, and for this I would point to a very good article by Dmitri Trenin, who may explain himself better than I will, recently in the framework of the Yuren, the EU-Russia expert network, on what it could be what we want from each other over the next 10 years. When it comes to that question, I have for some time advocated to come to a modus vivendi, which I call a cohabitation model between the two biggest neighbors on the continent, with different political DNA, different values, and different political objectives, such as in the French cohabitation, while Dmitri says that cohabitation suggests a common roof which does not exist. I say, at a time in international politics when many roofs have flown off and we're camping out in the cold of geopolitical rivalry, it would be enough to live on the same continent side by side for some kind of a cohabitation. Dmitri calls his proposal neighborliness. That should be the future idea of EU-Russia relations. And it, of course, alludes to the principle of international law of good neighborliness, which in Russian is dobrosоседство. Now, even Dmitri admits that the main principle of neighborliness, in his view, is managing adversity between Russia and the EU. And this is my last sentence. That's why I think the best translation for my cohabitation model is the Russian term of соседствование, which for non-Russian speaker also implies that we are neighbors, but at the time maybe not the best or not even good neighbors. But I think this cohabitation gives enough room to manage adversity and at the same time look at where we can really cooperate. And in substance, I would very much agree with Dmitri on what he has proposed as such issues, including climate change. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Markus. And if we get time in the second tour, perhaps we can discuss how cohesive the EU member states are in their attitudes to Russia. Let's go now to Alexey Gromyko. Alexey, very nice to see you back. And I see you seem to be in a Black Sea resort, sunning yourself, or perhaps it's the background to you. The question to you as director for the Institute of Europe at the Russian Academy of Sciences is this: do tensions in the EU-Russia relationship reflect top-down political direction on either side, or bottom-up pressures from business and civil society?
Giles, thank you very much, and I'm very glad to see you as well. The last time we met in Brussels, and we told each other that this situation was very bad. But I think that with hindsight, we should recognize that nowadays the situation is even worse than it was about a year ago. I've got 5 minutes and even less now, so I would like to air 4 or 5 points very shortly. My first point is that within wider Europe, I use the term wider Europe, not greater Europe, although I will come back to greater Europe a bit later. So within wider Europe, the significant part of tensions between Russia and the European Union from my point of view, is surely political self-made construction and invention. This is not something what has been inevitable. This is something what can be dealt with, what can be coped with. The question is on what terms and when. My second point is that these tensions which you referred to, these tensions have not emerged only from within wider Europe. To a significant extent, they have been the function of foreign policy of other major powers. Firstly, the United States, secondly, China, and the function of the foreign policy of some middle powers, which are many these days. Well, I mentioned the foreign policy of the United States to draw our attention to a situation when the United States in the past years have been obsessed with the idea of competition among major powers, great powers or major powers, strategic competition. This is something what was suggested to replace, all other concepts and doctrines which we on both sides had been trying to develop before, before even 10 years ago. Of course, some tensions which we have between Russia and the European Union, they are genuine. They reflect some natural and objective geostrategical and geo-economic differences. But let's not forget that if we use the term European Union, then the European Union is a very diverse phenomenon. And the attitude towards Russia within the European Union is diverse as well. Secondly, objectively and strategically, from my point of view, we have much more in common than most people think these days. I think that strategic partnership, not in a distant past, was within our reach. And even some elements of this strategic partnership were already in place. On the contrary, your question included the reference to business and social and societal pressure. It seems to me that, on the contrary, business and societal pressure push both sides, Russia and the European Union, to try to mend fences and to prevent the artificial imposition of deeply entrenched animosity and structural confrontation. And structural confrontation is something what we are heading to now, but this is not the direction which, in my opinion, is the natural and helpful destination to both of our sides. Well, of course, the pandemic does not help us because the pandemic hinders people from traveling, from meeting each other in person. It hinders tourists, it hinders students, it hinders business people. So the pandemic is, of course, not a positive, but a very bad additional factor in the regrettable situation which we have in the relationship between Russia and the European Union. And my last point, that in spite of what I have mentioned before, from my point of view, the bonds, be they historical, civilizational, geographic, religious, economic, social, you just name it, they are such that even in the present circumstances, at least for me, this is not a wishful thinking, not the castle in the air, but this is quite an obvious observation that that we are in a certain transition and very sad period. This is not a new normal. This is not our final destination. This is not a final point of our travel. But Russia and the European Union, or not just the European Union and Russia, but all the countries which inhabit our European continent and all organizations, sooner or later will come back to the groove of the strategic partnership concept. Now, for some, it seems to be fantastic. But if you think that it is objective, then sooner or later we will come back to the strategic partnership, or at least to some elements of this very good idea.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Alexey. And I hope we'll have enough time, if only to ask everybody whether they agree that there was a point at which a strategic relationship for a wider Europe was within our grasp, and how to grasp it again. Now we go to Tom Graham in Washington. Dr. Graham is a prominent US specialist on Russia who, in the George W. Bush administration, handled the Russia affairs in the National Security Council. And my question, Tom, is what's to be expected of a more common, shared US-EU stance on relations with Russia? I'm making the assumption that the Biden administration will be closer to Brussels than the predecessor Trump administration. Tom.
Thank you very much, Giles. And just as a correction, I'm actually sitting in New York and not Washington.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's much saner in New York than it is in Washington, so we see the world much more clearly. But also, as you know, as you've already mentioned, President-elect Biden has set revitalizing the transatlantic relationship as a priority after the disruption of the Trump presidency. And so with the EU, I think the attention will be focused, first of all, on repairing trade relations and developing a coordinated position on the swelling China challenge. But as you all know, Russia too will surely receive some attention, although the preference for the Biden administration will be what it has been for previous administrations, and that is to work the Russia issue largely through NATO channels. Now, I think the Biden's team firmly believes that the chances for success in dealing with Russia are greatly enhanced if American and European positions are closely coordinated, and that deprives Moscow of the ability to play on the divisions in the transatlantic community and between the major countries in Europe and the United States. When I was in the Bush administration, we also believed in this, and I think this is absolutely true. But I think that coming to an agreement on the specifics of a Russia policy might prove more difficult for the Biden administration than they have anticipated. We all know that the senior officials worked together in the Obama administration. Many of them worked before in the Clinton administration. And they're used to what they would say is leading Europe, and that is manipulating the divisions within Europe to press forward their preferred policies on anything, including Russia. And I would imagine that this approach will prove less successful now, even though, as you've already mentioned, Giles, the Europeans will welcome warmly President Biden after 4 years of Trump. Now, I think particularly after the weak the events of last week, questions abound about the character of America's democracy and its claims to global leadership. And a central question is whether Biden or Trump is the aberration in U.S. foreign policy, particularly given the strong showing of the Trump supporters in the elections to the Congress and state positions. And a final answer to that question will not emerge until the next presidential election in 2024 at the earliest. And so we're going to be in these circumstances of sort of doubt for some time. And I would imagine that means that the Europeans are going to be a bit more vigorous in pressing their positions, and that is tilting compromises in whatever approach we agree to more in their favor. So in my mind, the new administration is going to have to engage in a serious set of consultations with its European allies. It will have to listen more than simply broadcast its positions. And in addition, it will have to come to achieve compromises to create a coordinated position towards what we see as the Russia challenge. And so what is this going to mean for a common stance? I would make just 3 points. First, I think there's definitely going to be more dialogue with Russia, especially on the part of the United States. I think the Europeans will insist on that, especially in the area of arms control. They're going to want to see the United States engage in a serious discussion of strategic stability with Russia. They'll want us to take up Putin's proposal to ban the deployment of intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe. And they're certainly going to insist on being closely consulted on those talks. Now, I've had some conversations with people who have senior positions in the Biden administration, and it's clear to me that they do want to start a pragmatic dialogue with the Russians. So you're pushing on an open door with that. But I think the real question for the United States and the Europeans will be the extent to which we're going to consult and how close those consultations will be to keep everything on track. The second point is that I think we and our European partners are going to work on returning the United States to the Iran nuclear deal. Once that's done, I would imagine we'll see greater pressure on the Russians to deal with the other troubling aspects of Iranians' behavior, terrorist organizations, its expansionist regional policies. And then finally, I think on sanctions, what we're going to see is an effort to push the United States towards a more judicious and targeted use of those sanctions. We're not certainly going to see any easing of sanctions at this point, but I think we'll see something that is a bit more relaxed and targeted than we've seen in the past. The Europeans in particular are going to be leery of any unilateral extraterritorial sanctions that the United States may want to impose. I'd imagine that there will be a discussion of Nord Stream 2 project, and my guess is that will end with a decision by Washington to accept the completion of the project, in part because the Germans will insist on it, and the United States is not going to wreck its relationship with Germany over that pipeline. So I think in sum, we're going to see a set of policies coming out of the EU and the United States that aren't necessarily bad for Russia. I think the question is, how is Moscow, particularly after its stances over the past several months, going to readjust? How will it approach a new American policy, and I think closer coordination between Europe and the United States? What I think is possible is certainly not a radical improvement in relationship, but if we take the right decisions in Washington, Brussels, and Moscow, we certainly can stabilize the relationship on what is now at admittedly low level and move from there towards greater cooperation over the future. And in the current circumstances, I think that's actually a very good start.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Tom. And I think that is a perfect introduction to our fifth final speaker, Dmitri Trenin, who I think is so well known in the area of US, Russia, European relationships, running the Carnegie Moscow Center. And Dmitri, I think a lot of this, as Thomas says, comes back to security the NATO relationship. So I think my question is, how might the vicious circle of Russia complaining about encirclement by NATO and NATO complaining about Russian aggression, how might that vicious circle finally been broken? Because like all vicious circles, it's been getting more vicious, not less.
Well, Giles, thank you so much for addressing those questions to me, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me to the panel. Logically, both concerns should be put to rest without too much trouble, without too much problem. I stress logically. If you take encirclement, it doesn't mean what it used to mean in the first half of the 20th century. The June 22, 1941 complex still weighs heavily on the Russian strategic mind, but geography today does not equal geography in 1941. The NATO today has no equivalent among Russia's adversaries and enemies in the past. I would also say that non-membership in NATO is not a guarantee of friendliness or even toward Russia or even of predictable behavior. And I'm ready to point my finger to the countries that are not members of NATO in Europe, but are much bigger security problem for Russia today and will be in the foreseeable future than a lot of NATO members. So if there's one thing worse than NATO enlargement, it was the fierce opposition by Russia to NATO's enlargement. My second point would be that aggression is also about the images of the past. 1939 in the case of Poland, 1940 in the case of the Baltic states. Such a stance is historically rooted. It is politically understandable, or rather psychologically understandable, and politically it is useful to the countries that exhibit this stance, but it is as much divorced from the strategic reality of today as the encirclement fear in Russia. So much for the logic, but we all know that politics does not always follow the logical path. And I very much appreciate Markus Ederer's kind reference to my humble contribution to the debate on the Russia-Europe relationship. I think that politically, what needs to be done is to make the current situation as safe as possible, making it much safer than it is today. That requires more communication, that requires more context, that requires a set of measures aimed at conflict prevention, that requires confidence building measures, and that requires much better understanding of the other side, especially in this era of post-truths, in this era of echo chambers, when we cancel out people, cancel out views, and cancel out all those with whom we disagree. So it's the first layer. The second layer is assuming elements of neighborly attitudes. Mending fences, making sure that those fences deal with problems, but do not impede communication between people living on both sides of the divide. There are issues that bring us together because we are in close geographical proximity. Pandemic has been mentioned as an issue that led to the worsening of relationships. It should not. And I think that in the future, there are certainly possibilities of more international cooperation involving Russia on the issue of acting against the pandemic and supporting public health. Climate issues belong to the same category, and I would note that this is an area where Russia is becoming more aware of the problems that the Europeans have discovered some time ago. And of course, as Igor mentioned, economic collaboration is another very important factor here. And lastly, I think we need to accept diversity. Diversity, and I have, as you can imagine, I have a lot of intercourse with my colleagues in Washington, and one word that is very, very much used in Washington these days is diversity. We discuss diversity within even within our little Carnegie circle in Washington. So diversity is something that, unlike what we thought we should be working for in the past. So it's not so much, we should not, I don't think, we should not try to make us more like each other. That's not going to happen. Russia will not be what Europe is today, and Europe will not be what Europe was, let's say, 50 years ago, which for some Russians is an ideal Europe, which of course is so much rubbish. Russia will have a different political system. Russia will have a system of values that will diverge from that of Europe. And Russia will have its own security interests that may not always agree with European interests. And similarly, Europe looking from Russia. And accepting that diversity and dealing with that should be the third layer of, if you like, the program of walking toward a good neighborly, but initially just a neighborly relationship. And very finally, as Markus said, we're at a very low point in our relationship. We need to have a serious debate, serious and realistic debate about the relationship, not seizing upon the images of yesterday, but having a very sober look at what we have today, where we're all moving, and we're moving in different directions. It's not greater Europe or wider Europe. I don't think that those notions are of much use for the future. But making the neighborly relationship a good neighborly relationship should be a task for us in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dmitri. We haven't got any time left for a debate. My lax chairmanship. But just to finish, because we have to finish in 2 minutes' time, on a final thought. And it is that widening is right, but it's not wider Europe. It's a wider gap within Europe between the European Union, Britain, and so on, and Russia. And I think that this, listening to all of you, this widening gap is by drift, not by design. So it seems to me that if we're looking at the post-COVID world, hopefully there will be one, but I fear there's going to be a serious economic depression. And it therefore strikes me that we must, on both sides, in America, in Europe, and in Russia, be striving much harder to get the relationship onto a constructive agenda and away from the various sort of niggles and conflicts and frictions that have somehow risen up to the top of the agenda, with which pious thought, I think our time is now almost up to the second. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, for making the virtual journey to Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All the
colleagues.
best.
Thank you for your session and for the contribution. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Bye, Giles.
Thank you for the support.
Bye,
See you all in person soon, I trust.
Hopefully so.
Thank you, Giles. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.